The TPN team, SSLR and Fullard Mayer Morrison teams have pulled out all the stops to create a state of disaster rent recovery documentation pack. This documentation pack was designed because so many tenants have already stated to their landlords that the rent is at risk of non-payment. The Minister declared a state of disaster on the 15th of March and is expected to last for a period of 3 months, although the Minister can shorten or extend that period. So what does the rent recovery documentation pack include? The documentation pack has been designed where tenants are already in a paid-on-time status. They have a history of paying their rent on time and in full. Their rent is now at risk because their earnings are at risk. The first document is the declaration of earnings by the tenant. Here the tenant declares that their earnings are limited due to retrenchments, being placed on temporary unpaid leave, a lack of earnings in terms of commission, or where businesses have closed. Once the tenant has declared their earnings, a further agreement by way of the deposit utilization agreement or the deferment of rent agreement is then entered into. Ordinarily, a tenant's deposit is held in trust until the end of the lease and once the tenant has vacated. For the deposit utilization agreement, the tenant and landlord agree that the deposit will be used for rental payments whilst we're in a state of disaster. Once the state of disaster has been lifted, the tenant further agrees to reinstate their deposit by making installment payments over a period of time until the lease comes to an end. The deferment of rent agreement is an agreement where the landlord and tenant enter into a payment holiday. The tenant cannot afford the rent in full, in part, and so the landlord agrees to give the tenant a payment holiday whilst we're in the state of disaster. Once the state of disaster has been lifted, the tenant agrees to make installment payments to repay the landlord the amount of rent that has been lost in terms of the payment holiday. This is quite a liquid document, and should the tenant default on this document, it's easy for the landlord to take legal action against the tenant for the amount unpaid. There could be a situation where the lease has come to an end and the tenant is supposed to vacate, but the tenant is in isolation or self-quarantine. TPN has added an addendum of lease to the documentation pack, which allows the tenant and landlord to enter into a month-to-month lease on the same terms and conditions as the existing lease agreement. So what to do about tenants who are already in default and not paying their rent and have a history of partial payments or non-payment? Here, we suggest that the landlord or property manager continue with their collection process. Continue to share your tenant data with TPN and send out the Credit Bureau SMS notifications. Send your letter of demands. In fact, TPN has discounted our letter of demands by 50% while we're in the state of disaster period. Send your cancellation letters. We do know that many of the courts are not in full operation at the moment and no new matters are being brought to the court. But prepare your files so that when the state of disaster is lifted, you can immediately start the legal process. So, how do you access the rent recovery documentation pack? You'll find a link in the description below to the TPN shop. All of the documents are in the documentation pack, free of charge. There is no login and no registration. From the TPN, SSLR and Fullard Mayer Morrison teams, take care and stay safe.